Okay, folks, we'll kick it off. You're very welcome to this first of the Winter Milk Programme events. We originally planned on being out on farm, but weather dictated, unfortunately, that wasn't possible this spring. So instead of postponing, we said we'd do a webinar tonight, and hopefully we'll get back out on farm in the throughout the rest of the year. This Winter Milk Programme is a new strand of what is the joint programme between Aurivo and Teagasc. So we decided to do something a little bit different with the winter milk suppliers for this phase of the programme in workshop style events and webinars like this. So we are hoping that it will serve the needs of winter milk producers who are account for 25% of our milk pool, so an important part of the Aurivo milk pool, and we're keen to try and help you along as best we can. Joined tonight by James Dunne, who is a winter milk specialist with Teagasc, Daniel Hession, who is technical manager and nutritionist with Aurivo, and John McCabe, who is the joint programme advisor on the Aurivo Teagasc joint programme. So we'll not delay it any longer. We'll get straight into it, folks. We'll hopefully have all done and dusted in an hour and let you back to your evenings. Thanks very much for joining. And I'm going to move over to James, who's going to take us through some bits. Start off. James, over to you.
Yep. Good evening, Declan. And thanks. As you said, look what we had planned. I thought I was going to get a trip to Donegal or to Westmeath or to somewhere and get out on farm. But look at I suppose the first part, and I just have a couple of slides we want to maybe discuss where we're at from a grazing perspective in terms of it's been difficult on a lot of farms. It hasn't started on some farms in terms of some of the heavier farms. Ground conditions just haven't allowed. I'll quickly run through where we're at in Johnstown Castle. It's been difficult talking to Aidan today in terms of managing, obviously trying to get grass into cows. But I suppose the important point, and I'll come to it, is all isn't lost. There's a lot of conversation, Declan, around kind of peak production and peak performance. And the biggest single thing that will really impact on the performance, cow performance throughout that May, June, July period is how we actually act and correct pre-grazing yields over the coming weeks. We can always look back and say we should have, could have done things differently in some cases, but we are where we are now. So I suppose after running through where Johnstown Castle is at, we'll touch on that. So just speaking to Aidan today in terms of this is a grass walk he did about a week ago at this stage. A lot of grass on the farm in terms of a cover of 1250. Obviously, as everyone knows, difficult in terms of getting grass in. Actually did get out for a few days grazing in February. Was housed for a period, was housed actually for the best part of 20 days from that early February period across. On off grazing really by day. Aidan would never head out by night. Ultimately, we're looking at the block autumn herd here. There's no requirement to go out at night. There wouldn't actually be enough grass in the system if he did go out day and night grazing. So it was always, the plan was always to graze by day up until that late March period anyway. So as I say, there was about 20 days grazing missed. What has happened since over the last number of days is in terms of there's 2 bouts of grazing currently happening on farm. So cows are getting something in the region of probably 12, 13 kilos of grass being allocated. Obviously, in terms of there's difficulty in terms of grass utilization around that, it's probably, we're not that concerned about that at the moment. We'll talk about maybe correcting that as we go. Meal feeding has been kept at a steady 7-8 kilos right through up until now, and it's been dropped to 6 kilos. And cows are being offered silage, so even though they are getting 2 bouts of grazing in, on-off grazing is the only way that can be done at the moment. And there's silage in the diet at night. So silage isn't being restricted at all. And I know speaking to Donald here in Ballyhaise, that's how he's operating as well in Ballyhaise. So just to mention in terms of if we actually look at the wedge, you can see there in terms of the paddocks that were grazed, there is 1,1400 back on those second round paddocks. The difficulties there really is managing to limit damage now as we head into the second round. It looks like weather is improving, but just to make sure that there isn't a lot of damage done, we will continue it on-off grazing over the next week to 10 days. Couple of paddocks there at the top of that in terms of that 13.1 and 12.4. Those two paddocks will be taken out at the first opportunity. So the reason being, I suppose, is we have to do something at farm level, and maybe that's a conversation for farms. Depending on where we're at now, where do we actually go? If we took this wedge as an example of a farm that hasn't a lot of grazing done, really where we're going to start on those lower covers is the real message there. We need to start on those kind of 1,100-1,200 covers. We're probably working our way up from invert the wedge, as we say, and working our way up from the lower half of the wedge. And really the reasons we're trying to do that is we're trying to get through as much grazing area as possible. There will come a point where we get to along the line somewhere as we work through the second half of April and into early May, where we actually say, right, do you know what? We have to actually take out some surplus here and move on. And that's probably going to happen in a 3-week period type of thing. So for the farms that don't do that and we start grazing from the top down, ultimately, Declan, we're going to end up in a situation there where we're grazing 25-600 covers into the middle of May, and we're absolutely going to hammer cow performance there. We're going to hammer cow performance in terms of the quality of the swards we're grazing. We're also going to hammer have an impact on our residuals and our regrowths. So that's what I said earlier in terms of correcting pre-grazing yields over the next 3 weeks is really where it's at. So where are we at? Work from the kind of bottom end of the wedge up, and there will come a point where we actually need to take out surplus bales. Leaving those to first cut, depending on when it is, folks. If that first cut isn't in the first half of May, it's risky business depending on milking platform stocking rates. In a lot of cases, we actually need to take those as surplus, get them back into the system, and have them coming back in that third week of May, rather than be making them that third week of May, because we see farms that don't take them out quickly, that they end up running into trouble. So just in terms of, this is a study was done in Ballyhaise where they looked at an extended grazing season versus, we'll say, what the average was for the area. And as I said, in terms of, if we take it the average, or the late turnout group, as they're called here, is kind of what we were faced with this year. Not going to grass until late March by day, and then by April, maybe for 2 bouts of grazing. I understand completely that some farms may be on the call. Trafficability, that isn't even happening to now. But the point being is here, if we look at our green line, our average farm cover is obviously going to be up at 11, 12, 1,300 on these farms. What we're looking to do there is we're looking to manage that, as I said, graze the lower covers. But the key period here is that you can actually see average farm cover pretty much realigns come that second week of May, first 10 days, second week of May. So what we're looking to do is, yes, we are where we are, but correct pre-grazing yields by making the correct management decisions over the next 3 weeks. That's going to be critical for what I would say those main peak months are, Declan, which is May, June, July. If we don't do that, we're going to see high levels of meal going in, and even at that, cow performance is obviously going to be relatively standard to poor over that period. So we don't want this, what has happened to date, have an impact on the longer term as such. So I suppose that's what I have to say with regards grazing. On fertilizer, if we go back here, there's probably about a third to a half of the platform in Johnstown Castle that has actually got fertilizer, to the tune of about 40 units. There's parts of the farm where it just trafficability wouldn't allow, and weather conditions wouldn't allow. So I suppose talking to Aidan today in terms of what he's doing is he's topping that up over the coming days with 40 units of nitrogen there. So growth rates have actually been fairly consistent, and with what we would see other years. But I suppose we'd just be concerned where fertilizer isn't out, when the conditions allow and when trafficability allows. It's maybe hard when there's 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 kilos of grass out there, but they're actually the swards that probably need it more. And if we don't, we do run into the risk then of maybe reduced growth rates into late April, early May, when we do need high levels of growth rate to get this corrected. So that's just a mention on fertilizer as well.
James,
Okay.
I might come in there just to ask you a question about that shorter grazing season trial in Ballyhaise. Um, would that the early the red line is the
It's
it's
the early turnout group.
early turnout, and the green is the late turnout. So basically they didn't get out until like a similar spring to this year.
Didn't get out till late March, early April. Yep.
Would it be fair to say that Donald Patton whipped it into shape so much that it was kind of there was not much difference in the summer as
Yeah.
a result of him really getting going after it
And
in April.
that 100%, John, and that's exactly the point in terms of saying all isn't lost. But I suppose the management decisions that was made within that trial to get back on track was what was key, I suppose. Cow performance from May, June, and July actually didn't differ across the groups. Yes, in the spring where we were in on silage for a longer period, protein was lower. We were feeding higher levels of concentrate, and that has been and that is the right thing to do, and has been the right thing to do in this spring. Like when we were in on silage, we needed to be feeding 7 or 8 kilos of concentrate. We know that. It's no different than having the cow calved in September, October. She needs that 7 or 8 kilos of concentrate. But the point being is here, when we correct pre-grazing yields, as you say, you can get that corrected probably over a 3 to 4 week period, John. The heavy silage program is the exact same. And when we look at the stats from that over a 7 year period, on average, they get about 30% of the farm grazed in March. But actually, when we look at their pre-grazing yields in May, they're bang on their 1,500 covers. So it's what happens in that second half of April, first week of May, that's going to be really, really critical.
Yeah. And the tools you mentioned there, James, is inverting the wedge, heading for that lower covers, trying to graze out more ground sooner when you go out. Just in terms of making the decision to bail out that last couple of paddocks, when do you make that decision, or how can you decide, right, I have enough grass ahead of me, let's take out whatever's left on the first rotation?
100%. So look at it. It's at that point where you have those 12-1300s back on your paddocks that you can come back. So you're probably looking at 3 paddocks at that stage that need to have 12-1300 on them. What I would say is there's an opportunity there, depending on how many paddocks you have and depending on your stocking rate, Declan. You may take out a couple fairly lively when conditions allow, and have them coming back in. It's no different than the cows grazing them. Have them coming back into the system. Then you may decide, you know what, I need to take another one in 3 weeks' time. Or you might say, look, I'm going to skip over 2. I might have to come back to 1. Another thing which Donald would have done in Ballyhaise was mix and match. He would have maybe went on to a second round paddock with 12-1300, but if he was a little tight or felt he was a little tight, maybe grazed a first round paddock with it. And unfortunately, those paddocks are going to be up over 2,000 of a cover. But what I would say is if you're relatively lowly stocked, you can actually take some of that area as soon as you can in terms of trafficability. That may be 2 or 3 weeks for some farms. But then there's probably another decision to be made then, can I actually take another 1 or 2, or do I need to skip over 1? The skipping over 1 gives you insurance, Declan. So the worst thing you can do is continue to graze. Like if you think it's right to skip on, but you're worried, skip on and have it in your back pocket. Like just don't cut it right away. Having 1 in your back pocket just saves you in terms of if you are going to get tight. But grazing it, ultimately at that stage we're growing 70, 80 a day when we come into mid-May. All your other paddocks then are getting out of kilter. So that's something that I always say to farms. If you're fearful and you think you're going to be tight, jump on, graze the paddocks when they're at 1,1400, because that's what we should be doing, and come back if you have to come back, type of thing. So it's just, we need to be measuring. I know there's some people probably on the call that aren't, but it's much, much easier to make the decision when you have the data in front of you in terms of how much grass, where growth rates are at. So as I say, 1,1300 back on 2 or 3 paddocks at least, and you can mix and match.
So James, what you're saying is that we'll be going from feeding silage to making silage in the space of potentially 2 weeks.
100%.
And that's the right thing to do.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's a hard one. People are maybe on the call going, is what's wrong with this chap? But the reality is, if we don't, John, we're grazing 2,000 covers into June. and that's going to have a massive impact on cow performance. The other thing is, if we look, and it's been a difficult spell, but grass has kept growing. It's been it's been a ground conditions issue. If we look back at 2018, it was a real cold, dry snap we had. The grass wasn't actually there. So the reality is there's loads of feed out there. Unfortunately, it's got out of hand on some farms, and it's just a matter of correcting that. But the big thing is that we need to get grass into cows' diets from here on in as weather improves. Even it is only 3 hours to limit damage. There's work in it, but the benefits are big.
Lovely stuff. Jane, are you going through your next slides, or are we going to Daniel?
I'll stop sharing and we'll let Daniel jump in. If there is any questions, we can take them as we go, Declan.
Yeah, the Q&A function is at the bottom of the screen there, folks. So put in any of your questions there that you want, and we'll put them to the panel at the end once all the presentation's gone through. So Daniel, the floor is yours if you want to share your screen there now.
Thanks, Declan. Hopefully you should be able to see that now.
It's just going to go into presentation mode. Yeah, way to go.
Great. Okay, thanks, Declan, and good evening all. So for the next couple of minutes, I suppose I want to follow on essentially on some of what James had talked there about silage, and I suppose really looking at our main foot of silage and how we manage that in terms of making the best quality silage that we can. So overall, what impact silage quality has in a winter milk system. So when we talk, I suppose, about quality, we have to have some kind of measurements for quality. And I suppose if we're talking about nutritional quality of a silage, or maybe how well it's preserved or fermented, excuse me, our quality measures will change or vary a little bit. So this evening we're focused really on nutritional. So for me, the three key indicators of quality are the DMD percentage, the crude protein percent, and the dry matter percent. And I suppose a lot of you will be familiar with DMD, and we really focus in on DMD when we talk about silage quality. So why and what is DMD? So DMD stands for dry matter digestibility. So essentially what that is, it's after we get rid of all the moisture, that's what's left. So that's the dry matter. And that's important because that's what the cow, calves, weanlings, whatever it is that we're feeding silage, gets their nutrients, their energy and their protein and so on out of. The digestibility piece then simply is how digestible that dry matter is. And that's crucial because the more digestible something is, the more energy and protein and so on that the animal can get from that dry matter. So that's why DMD is a key measure, because it tells us two key things about silage. It tells us the energy value. So in other words, for each kilo that the cow consumes, what level of energy is in that or quantity of energy. And it also tells us the intake potential, or gives us a good guide on the intake potential. So if we had a measure that told us the energy, but we didn't know how much of it the cow can eat, it wouldn't be very useful. So the good thing about DMD is it covers both. So we can then know roughly how much the cow will eat of a given silage based on DMD. And for each kilo that the cow consumes, what's the energy value or the quantity of energy, if you like, per kilo or per bite. So for every measure, if we have a measure, we have to have a target. So in terms of our dry matter, we're looking at 28 to 32 typically. If we start going above that, we'll have issues in terms of mold. And if we go below that, we can reduce intake, and we can also have issues in terms of preservation. In terms of our crude protein, really in a winter milk scenario, we'd like to get that up to 15% if possible, because it really helps then in terms of the overall diet. The concentrate that goes in there will be at a lower crude protein percentage. So anywhere from 13 to 15 it will be our target. In terms of DMD, well, really we're looking for the sky's the limit, so the higher the better, but certainly we want kind of 74, 75 DMD silage plus. If we just look at the silage that we've tested in the lab for last season, so the 2022 to 2023 season, that's give or take around 2,000 or in excess of 2,000 samples per season. And by season, I mean kind of October to sort of March, April of the following year. So dry matter around 32, so we're fairly on target there. DMD 69 and crude protein 13. So crude protein, not too bad overall. DMD, we're below our targets for a winter milk system. Average or nationally, silage is sort of put at kind of 67, 68%. So we're slightly ahead of that, but there's considerable scope there to improve that in any context, but particularly in the context of a winter milk system. So I said that DMD can impact on intake or gives us a good indication of intake. So let's look at some data now and have a look at the effect of silage DMD on intake. So if we take two sort of fairly different silages here, we have a 67.6 rather, and a 75.7. And if we look at the intake in terms of kilos of dry matter per day that the cow can consume, it's just over 1 for the lower quality silage, and it's 11.6 for the 75.7 silage. So straight away there now, before we look at anything about energy value, the cow was able to consume about 1.5 kilos of dry matter per head per day more on the higher quality versus the lower quality silage. If we follow that through then and look at the energy value, so for a 65, its UFLs per kilo of dry matter is 0.72. For 75 DMD silage is 0.85. And if we get up to kind of 78, 80, we're looking at 0.88 or 0.9. Just to put in context what a UFL is, so that's the way we measure energy, or one of the ways we measure energy. And what a UFL equals is the energy in 1 kilo of standard air-dried barley. So pretty much if you have a kilo of barley in a bucket in front of you, that represents 1 UFL. So we can see the lower DMD silage in our example here, the 65 DMD silage has about 72% of the energy value of 1 kilo of barley, whereas the higher quality, if we take an 80 DMD silage, would be about 0.9. That has 90% of the value in terms of energy of a kilo of barley. So a significant difference there between our high quality and our poor quality. So let's follow that up now and look at an on-farm scenario. So we've our two silages here. We've silage A and B. I've kept the dry matter the same for both just to make the sums a little bit easier. We've our DMD of 67 and we've a 75. So we know from our previous slide that our UFL per kilo dry matter is 0.75 or 0.85 for the higher quality silage. So essentially what that means is for each kilo of dry matter that the cow consumes, she's taken in 0.75 or 0.85 UFL. Cow A can consume around 10 kilos of dry matter of that silage, and cow B, because it's a higher quality, a higher DMD and lower fiber, she can eat more, so she can eat 11.5 kilos of dry matter of that silage. So if we work our way through then, cow A takes in 10 kilos of dry matter of 0.75, so her total intake of that is about 7.5 UFLs, that's her total energy intake. And that covers the cow's maintenance requirement. So it prevents her from losing condition. She should maintain condition within reason on that. And she can support about 3.3 to 3.5 litres of milk on that. If we take the higher quality silage, she can consume more. And each bite or each kilo has a higher energy density. So she's taken in a higher level of UFL, so 9.8. So that'll support her maintenance and additionally 8.5 litres of milk. So we can see there now a fairly striking distance before we go any further at all. A fairly striking difference there in terms of the energy that's left over, if you like, after we fed the cow for maintenance to produce milk. And that's a combination of that higher intake and higher energy value. So if we look then, obviously we need to balance up that diet to get to a certain level of milk yield. So in this scenario, we're looking at 30 litres. And look, that's reasonably moderate. There'll be some that'll be looking to go up above 35, even to 40. So we've taken 30 as our example here. So our cow A on silage A has an intake we know of 10 kilos. So to meet that 30 litres of milk, sorry, we need to feed around 12 to 12.5 kilos of concentrate. That's given a total intake of 20.75 kilos of dry matter. And if we put a meal cost on that 12.5 kilos, we're working out at about €5.15 per day. And that's just the meal element of that diet. If we take silage B then, so a higher intake here, 11.5 kilos, so lower concentrates in this scenario, about 9.5 to 10. And the meal cost there is around 3.9. 390. So a considerable difference, about 125, if I'm doing my maths right at the top of my head. So if we have a 100 cow herd, that's 80 to €100. So there's a significant difference there per day on the meal cost. Now we could cost in further there our cost of our silage, and our silage cost will be a little higher, potentially on our silage B there because they're consuming more, but our meal cost is lower, so our total cost per day will be down because of that higher quality silage. And I suppose one thing to note there, that 12.5 is a high input of concentrates. If we run the figures there in terms of the percentage of concentrates to forage in the diet, we're nearly at that 50-50 balance. So if we go beyond that, we're really on a knife edge, if you like, in terms of that cow having issues with acidosis, and that then could have a knock-on effect in further reducing intake and affect our fat content and so on. So we're really at a kind of a tricky point there, and we need careful management. Most likely we might go 2.5 of that maybe as a midday feed, which adds to labour. Or if we're putting it in through the wagon again, there's additional labour there and cost in terms of mixing that. So really and truly, we want to be in scenario B there with our higher quality silage and get an advantage of that higher intake and the higher energy per kilo.
Just Daniel, just before you go on to that one, sorry, we just have one question in. Is the screen gone blank? But it's not. It's working away there on other phones. So just that person, if they want to maybe go out and come back in again, or if anyone else is having any issues, just put it in the Q&A function. But looks like we're all good. Daniel, back to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Declan. So we've looked now at, I suppose, what we define as good quality silage, the impact in a farm scenario. So we'll have a look now at the main factors that can affect, and by affect here I mean reduce silage DMD. So top of the list there is lodging. That can be anywhere from about 6 to 9 percentage units drop in DMD. Not grazed, 7%, roughly 5 to 7. Now, I suppose just to point out, there's probably some of you that haven't silage ground grazed this year. Don't get too excited because that is in a scenario where it wasn't grazed since very early autumn. Okay, so there's a considerable time. So some of you would have maybe not grazed in spring, would have grazed in late autumn. So the drop wouldn't be as significant in the example here. Old pasture, and I suppose the key about that is now that it's low ryegrass. So just because you have old pasture, if it still contains a high level of ryegrass, that the effect won't be the same. This is a scenario where it's old pasture and there's a low percentage of perennial ryegrass. There's about a 5% drop. The 1 week delay in cutting averages out at around 3 to 3.3 percentage units for every week delay, and bad preservation then, or heating that feed out, 3 for each of them. So I've highlighted the delay in cutting there because that's the one that we're going to focus on and just follow on a little bit here now this evening in our example. So if we take that a step further and we have a look at our effect of harvest date. So we've a couple of harvest dates here across the top, and we've the corresponding DMD and the crude protein. So if we look maybe at our 17th of May, we'll take that as our typical kind of mid-May cut that we talk about for very high quality. And if we push that out to end of May, 31st of May, we can see two things. So on the second line, in terms of our DMD, we have a fall in our DMD of about 6, almost 7 percentage unit points in DMD. If we look at our crude protein, we're also seeing a fall there as well in terms of our protein. So we're gone from that 13.6, and remember our target is kind of 13 to 15, and we're gone down to 10.7 or 11. So that's going to have an effect of lowering our energy intake on that silage. The cow will be able to consume less of that silage, but we'll also have to go in now with a higher ration in terms of crude protein to make up for that fall in protein. So we're being hit on the double there, if you like. So I suppose why do we delay, or why do people delay harvest date? And I suppose typically, and maybe in a scenario like this spring, a lot of the time it's to bulk it up a bit and to increase yield a bit. And if we look at an example here now, I suppose it's important to point out that this is grass data. So we wouldn't get the corresponding DMD values or the exact corresponding yield in terms of silage when we put this into the pit, for example. But it tells us the story that we want to see. So if we look at the 15th of May, the yield in terms of tons of dry matter per hectare is, we'll say, 5 tons of dry matter. And if we compare that with the 29th of May or the end of May cut, it's about 6.8. So for that delay in harvest, we've increased really only by 1.8 tons of dry matter per hectare. That's not going to correspond to the same tonnage in terms of silage, and there will be some losses then associated with that. So really and truly, the point here is for the hit that we're going to take in terms of DMD and protein, that extra sort of ton and a half of dry matter per hectare is not worth it in the long run.
That's going to be a real one this year, like with pits empty and silage stocks depleted completely, Daniel. Like the temptation is there to let it go on. Even fertilizer maybe not out in some silage ground yet, but like we really have to. That just shows you the difference in terms of the feed value. But that doesn't say is, you're going to delay your second cut. You're going to be pushing out that second cut further into the back end or to the later in the summer and leave you limited options then if you want to get a third cut in late August or September. Like, so it really is, being penny wise to mind the extra few bits to get that early cut in and go again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose I could have followed up. There's other data there, and John might have it. But if you look at your total production then over the year from that piece of ground, as you said, you've pushed out your second cut, and that second cut yield then is going to be lower. So as a consequence, then the total yield per hectare for the year is down. Because you've pushed out, so you haven't really achieved anything, and all you've done is you've hit your DMD and your protein then in that silage. So you've costed yourself significantly in the long run, essentially. Just an interesting one is around wilting, and look, we advocate that silage will be wilted rapidly, an emphasis on the word rapidly, and we'll see why in a minute. But essentially, while wilting dries out silage, increases the dry matter, increases intake, it does actually reduce silage DMD. So if we look at the example there on the table, we can see unwilted versus wilted silage, the dry matter increases significantly, so up to that sort of target that we talked about at 30-32 in the wilted silage. But we can see the corresponding effect in terms of DMD. So there is a loss in DMD, and that's because we're losing some of the nutrients and we're increasing the ash content. So that's what's bringing down that DMD. But minimal losses we'll tolerate because of the benefits that are associated with the dry silage. But my point here is that a prolonged wilt is not preferable, and you're really again only reducing your DMD. So the exact hit or penalty that you take in terms of DMD depends on the time between when the grass is cut and when it goes into the pit or the bales, but it can vary somewhere that research has shown somewhere between 0.2 and 1% for 10 hours. So really each day that grass is left to wilt can reduce your DMD by about 0.5 to 2%. And that's the same effect as if you had delayed harvesting by up to 4 days. So be mindful of that when you're going to wilt. Ensure that you can wilt it. Don't be trying to wilt it when there really isn't any great drying conditions, because you are only hitting that DMD. And if you leave it sort of 2 days or so, you've taken a nice bit off in terms of that DMD. And I suppose the quicker we can do that, the rapid wilt. So really 24 hours is probably the max that we should leave that down for, and capitalize on the width. So get that grass spread out across the ground surface and capitalize in on any sunshine or breeze or wind that's there. I just wanted to put this one in, and I'm coming to an end then, Declan, just in terms of time. I just called it showery weather, and I thought it was an interesting one. Look, we've all been guilty, I'd say, of delaying cutting silage for a couple of days because the weather maybe wasn't full on raining, but there was some showers and maybe we were ready to cut and then there was a shower and we put it off. And then all of a sudden the contractor has to move on and he goes to the neighbour and then he goes somewhere else and then maybe he gets broke down or something and he's next thing there's 5 or maybe 7 days gone by the time he comes back to us. So really we've probably been trying to be wise in terms of dodging showers and getting drier silage, but we probably haven't benefited anything really. So the data here, what's presented in the middle column is the grass was cut and it was put into the pit straight away. Over here it was wilted for over a day, and then on the left-hand side here, there was actually water or moisture applied to the grass that was cut to lower the dry matter. So we can see that's 13% dry matter, that's almost 19, and that's 28. Okay, so a fair difference. In terms of our dry matter intake of silage, the wilted silage has a higher intake. If we look though at the key line here, we've been talking about milk yield now for the last couple of minutes. There's no difference in milk yield. If we look at our solids, there's a slight increase in terms of our solids, but essentially the yield is no different. So really, the key message from here is, and Tim Keady that undertook that research would say that if you ensilage during showery weather, there's no negative impact on performance, essentially. And his point is often that if it's ready for cutting when it's dry, well, it's ready for cutting in the showers. Now, I'm not saying that you go out in the pouring rain and go cutting, but though that type of typically sort of passing showers, don't let that put you off, because it could turn into a few days, as I said, and you've hampered your DMD then and the best silage that you can make. So finally then back to our effect of silage DMD. This time, I suppose we've looked already at sort of milk yield, what we have to feed in terms of concentrates to bring up that diet, but there is an effect also on milk solids. So again, we've looked at some of this data now already in terms of intake, but look at the composition, no difference in terms of fat. But if we have 67 silage versus a 75, 78, we can see that the protein is higher. And that's repeated or replicated across a number of trials, be it in Teagasc or be it in Hillsborough and Athby in the north of Ireland. That effect, or that positive effect on protein, is evident across the trials. So in terms of takeaway messages, so look, in terms of quality, when we talk about quality, our DMD is key, and our target for the winter milk system is 74, 75 plus. Each 1% increase then in silage DMD increases milk yield by about 0.33 of a kilo. If we delay harvest date, that's the main factor that's going to affect our silage DMD. Essentially, it's probably one of the main things that we can control. We can't really control if there's a bit of lodging or whatever, but harvest date is the main one that's within our control. So 1 week delay in cutting reduces DMD by 3.3 percentage unit points. And to maintain animal performance due to a 1 week delay in cutting, is an additional 1.82 kilos of concentrates dry matter per day. So that is dry matter. So that translates to over 2 kilos per day of fresh weight. So just to maintain that level of animal performance, so for argument's sake, if it's 30 litres, because we've delayed cutting 1 week, we need to go in with, roughly speaking, an additional 2 kilos of meal per day. So look at, if you take anything from this, focus in on that harvest date and focus in on the DMD. So dig out the results of your silage for this season that you made last year. And if it was a 70, try and get that even to 73, 74. If it was a 72, try to get it to a 75. And if you're a 75, try and drive that on even further. If you're on 67, 68, let your first target be trying to get to maybe 70 or 72 and push on beyond that. Then you'll see benefits in terms of increased milk yield, better solids in terms of your protein, and a lower meal input, and cows will be in better condition.
So Daniel, we have a couple of questions for you, but we'll hold them off until the end. We'll pass on to John there if you want to share your screen, John.
Yeah. And I suppose, look,
you're going to go over a bit on getting us back on track for fertilizer and a few bits like that, John.
Yeah, well, I'm going to nail my colours to the mast and give a cutting date that's early. Whether some people agree with it or not, we'll get into the nitty gritty of it. But I suppose it comes back to my point of maybe we'll be turning to making silage not long after feeding silage, and we have to remind ourselves that it's the 16th of April. I was on a farm last Friday, and the farmer said it felt like the 100th of January. Which to be fair, I thought it was a fair point. But we are going to have to, like James and Daniel have said, we're going to have to kind of whip into action. And I suppose, look, just as before I share my slides, Declan, and to follow on from what Daniel said, if we can get that DMD of the silage up to in between 75 to 80 DMD, we'll be getting a poor response to the highest level of feed, the last 3 or 4 or 500 kilos a meal, and that's what we want to do. So I suppose in a way we want to be a victim of our own success. If we're feeding 2.5 ton a meal, or if we're feeding 2 ton a meal, we want that last 500 between 500 kilos between 1.5 tons and 2 ton. We want that to be nearly questionable, because we want to have our silage so good that if we up the meal from 7 to 10, we're not actually going to get 3 litres of milk. We'll get a litre and a half, and it's not going to cover itself. That'll mean we'll be kind of a victim of our own success, in that the last part of that diet, the extra kind of 3 kilos from 6 or 7 up to 9 or 10, that they won't pay. And I suppose, look, the more fibre you push into your silage by delaying it out into May, the less the cow is going to be able to eat, and actually the more response you'll get to that concentrate. So like fibre, we want to reduce the amount of fibre, the amount of stem, because we want the cows to eat more silage, and we want the cows to eat better silage, like Daniel has said. So I suppose that's where we're coming from when we're talking about cutting dates and DMD. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that now?
Yeah, we're good to go, John.
And it's in the right mode.
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, so yeah, so basically, look, to get into it, and there's a little bit of a crossover between myself and Daniel here, because we're talking about the same thing in terms of silage, but the aim is high yields, very digestible silage, and well preserved. That's aim 1 over the next 5 to 6 weeks. Aim 2 is to follow up from what James said, is that get everything in order as quick as possible. That's the other aim, so that we can get back onto an even keel as early as possible in the summer. Just to reiterate, the further you go into May with your cutting date, the more fibre, the more bulk. You'll take it off your second cut, and you'll have an expensive winter diet, and cows won't be able to eat as much of it, as we said. And the closer you come to the 1st of May, the opposite of that. So less fibre, less bulk, but you will gain it back in the second cut, and you'll have a cheaper winter diet with bigger intakes. Just in terms of silage making and an efficient silage block or silage fields, we really need to look at the soil fertility. And just this slide would show that basically, if we have our soil fertility sorted, our silage swards will bulk earlier. If we have low K, low acidic soil, so poor pH down in the 5.8s and 9s, low P, it'll be longer. They won't bulk, and we're going to be waiting for bulk, and then the quality will go out of it. So as I said, just to nail my colours to the mast in terms of advice for winter milk herds this year after a tough spring, based on, I would say, cut in that window between the 5th to the 10th of May if you can. Get it done. Get it done and go again. Get everything onto an even keel, as I said. Get the slurry out and get a good second cut crop by the last week of June. That's the advice from the Aurivo Joint Programme this year, is to try and get it all done. And I suppose I've looked at this in a few different ways, in that we do have ground ungrazed since the end of September, start of October. That really needs to be gone by the 5th of May for it to feed a winter milk cow in a profitable way, because it's going to start to drop. It could drop from good quality to poor quality within the space of a week if we don't do it. The other point is, you could split your fields, or split your first cut. Not too many people would be up for that, I suppose, after the spring that's been and the back end we had last year. A lot of work done, and we might be looking for the easy life. And if you're going to do that, I would say cut early. There may be a paddock that might be light, and you could bail that up a bit later, and that would be your way of cutting it without having to go at tires on the and pulling back the sheet. Or if you're focused, or if you're committed enough, I suppose, to splitting the first cut, that could be that's your own decision. I suppose based on so much variability out there with fertilizer not spread, slurry spread, slurry not spread, grazed, ungrazed, all of the rest, I think this is a kind of a happy medium in terms of yield and quality, and get everything onto an even keel, as I said, and go for the second cut. But that's going to be a call you're going to have to make yourself. Just in terms of what I said, like if it's not grazed since October, it needs to be gone by the 5th of May, really, to feed a liquid milk cow with high quality. If it was grazed bare in autumn or spring, we would say it kind of needs to be cut before the 12th of May, so a week later. And if it's grazed recently, it really needs to be cut before the 18th or 20th of May for a winter milk cow. And so basically you're talking about sometime the bank holiday on 2 weeks after that, and depending on whether it was grazed or ungrazed. And I think if you have a mix of, or 50-50, some of it was grazed and some of it hasn't been touched since October, I think earlier the better, and set the soil out for the second cut. So back again, I've just wanted to maybe just say that's the time we're saying. In terms of fertilizer, we need to remember, and we do, most people remember this, to be fair, but just remember it's 2 units per day. And we're talking about the 5th to the 10th of May. It's the 16th of April now. It's wet.
3 weeks today is the 6th of May.
Yeah, 3 weeks today. So that's 21 days. And if we don't get the fertilizer out for another 3 or 4 days, because to be fair, the soil is taking, it's going to have to dry out in some cases. It could be less than 20 days. So we have to remember the 2 unit per day rule. Sulfur. We talked about protein. Daniel talked about protein there. Sulfur is important for protein percentage in as well as cutting date. But sulfur, the spreading of fertilizer is important for protein percentage of our silage. Which, if we can get our higher protein, will save money next winter. Potassium, K. We need K to bulk our silage. If we're cutting in 3 weeks' time, we have to be realistic about the amount of K we can put out. And then lastly, P allowances. Can't just go out and spread 0730 if we don't have an allowance for it. So we're going to have to check up with whoever does your books, check with your advisor, see if you have a P allowance. If you don't, it has to be a fertilizer without P, or else you will get penalised. Just in terms of fertilizer, again, it's too late for slurry. Too high of a risk of it coming back in the silage. So if it got slurry already, you're covered for P and K. So if it got slurry already this spring, you're covered for P and K, and then it's just a nitrogen question. And then you also have to plan, when are you going to cut? And this is all something that you're going to have to work out yourself. It's not something that we can go all on the same day. We're going to have to play the field that's in front of us. So maybe just to go down through 1 or 2 scenarios in terms of, like I've said, taking a field that has nothing spread to date. And we're aiming to cut it in, we'll call it 3 weeks, in that window I was talking about on the 5th to the 10th of May, if the weather allows you to do it. We really can't go with too much K or too much nitrogen. So a bag and a half of 27-0-14 plus S, that's a protected urea that is available through most of the Homeland stores. So a bag and a half of that is delivering you 40 units. 20 days, 40 units, 2 units a day. I have some K and I have S. So it's as good as we're going to probably get at this stage. Or you could go with a bag and a half of cut sword plus S, but it doesn't have the protection on it, and we all need to get into the protected urea. Or 2 bags 18-6-12 plus sulfur if you have an allowance. That's one option. So this is in a scenario where there's nothing spread to date, and we're going to try and cut it in that early window for liquid milk cows, trying to get that silage DMD into the 75 to 80 DMD. A field that was grazed and got slurry, we'll say it's covered for the P and K. We'll say 1.5 bags of protected urea plus sulfur if it goes now. And if it doesn't go now, if it's delayed by 5 or 6 days, we're talking bringing that down to 1.25 bags of protected urea. And then if it doesn't go out for a couple of weeks, I suppose that's the advice on nitrogen. The reason I have upped the N in a scenario where it's grey is because we will be able to cut it that little bit later. So I suppose just to go back a slide, it's too late for slurry. And remember, 2 units per day, sulfur, K, and do you have a P allowance or not? So back to the aims, we need high yields, digestible silage, well preserved to minimize the losses and to constrain our costs. And we need to get everything back in order as quick as possible. So that's it from me, James. In a spring like this, as I said, we can go from feeding silage to making silage in 3 weeks. And I suppose the thing is to have the silage pits cleaned out. That it is the 16th of April, and we'll want to be going soon.
Lovely, John. Thanks for that. So, folks, we'll pass back on to James again. So that is the advice for, if you want that real high quality liquid milk is required in that system, silage for that system. That's the recommendations at the moment. So, James, you're going to go through a few bit of costings now for us for the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so we'll try to move through these, Declan. This is probably more so when John contacted me, I don't know what it was, John, 3 months ago, we didn't think we'd be talking about correcting pre-grazing yields coming into the second half of April. But look at, in terms of what we have, and some people would have seen this slide, Declan. This slide was presented at the Winter Milk Open Day. Aurivo representatives on the National Milk Agency would have seen it. So we would have been asked by the National Milk Agency last year, in light, I suppose we've been working closely with them over the last few years, in light in terms of the cost increases from 21 into 22, we had to project forward into 23. So what you're looking at here, folks, is we have a sample of farmers, winter and liquid milk farmers, who complete a profit monitor. Just over 100 farmers. I've no doubt some of the people on the call are actually included in some of this analysis. And what we do is we analyze that data to see where the average costs are for keeping the liquid or winter milk cow over that annual period. So if we just focus on the costs, and these costs are variable and fixed costs, it's important to mention in terms of when we're looking at costs then at an individual farm basis, break-even costs will be higher when you take in capital repayments, drawings, taxation. And I suppose what I would say at the outset is from 2021 to 2023, we've seen costs increase by over 450 euros. Significant increase. If we go back to 2015 to 2021, we've seen costs increase on average across the average cow by another 400 odd euros. So we're looking at something in the region of 850 to 900 euros of an increase in costs from 2015 to 2023. So I suppose it's important to outline at the start, people need to know in terms of their own costs where they're at. You can do that by completing a profit monitor. Maybe other people have ways of doing that, but know where your own costs are at for the farm. In 2021, total cost to keep the average winter milk cow stood at 1,934 euros. That increased to 2,397 euros in 2022. A lot of that due to obviously what happened in Ukraine in terms of the cost of fertilizer and feed. But what we have seen over the period since, there's been a creeping of other variable costs and fixed costs as well. So we projected forward based on 2022 and the list of assumptions used. So when we're using our assumptions, we say that the input quantities will remain the same, Declan, but the price of those inputs will change. So where a farmer actually reduces inputs, obviously that's going to be a saving on costs also. So we projected that the cost of keeping the cow for last year would be 2,386 euros. If we look, and I pulled down the data recently, where we actually have over 100 e-profit monitors completed annually again, and we pull down the actual cost. So the projected cost, as I outlined, were 2,386 euros. the actual costs were €2,390. So I actually had a chat with Joe Patton about this, and he wanted to know where the €4 went missing. But I think we did a pretty good job. We got within €4 of a projection. We didn't do a bad job. But the reality is, if we look there in terms of, we projected feed to be at €745. There's something in the region about 1.88, 1.9 tonne of feed going in terms of average across, annualized across the herds. It was 746. You can see there in terms of fertilizer was very similar. Total variable costs were pretty much where we'd say they were going to be, and fixed costs, and we end up with just €2,400. That is massive in the space where we're saying over a couple of years we've an extra £500 there, the best part of it. If we take that across 6,000 litres, Declan, that's something in the region of 7 to 8 cent a litre there of increase across those periods. What I would say is these are averages. Averages are dangerous in the fact that you will find people that are above that. High cost doesn't always mean high output. Sometimes I think we forget about the fact we're in a higher cost system. There's no doubt about that. When we're producing milk over that winter period, we are in a higher cost system. That doesn't mean we can go free for all with costs. Costs do matter, and the easiest way to manage costs, and probably sick listening to it, but the reality is what the lads are after speaking about there is it's silage quality, it's forage quality. So yes, we need to make really, really high quality silage. But we also need to manage that grass in that grazing period as well, folks, because that does make up a large proportion of the forage for the year as well. So when you see there in terms of total costs, if we look at the forage budget costs, you're looking at feed, you're looking at fertilizer, and you're looking at a fair chunk of contractor. It's heading for 50% of the total cost now of keeping the cow. So managing the feed budget is absolutely critical in terms of managing costs at farm level. Just then, in terms of we projected forward for 2024 based off the actual costs in 2023. So what we done was we took the baseline costs for 2023 across those 100 farms, kept the input quantities the same again, but we have adjusted in terms of where we believe the inputs will be at. You're looking at that in terms of if we say, right, feed, and we're going to get €65 a tonne of a save, and I think everybody's kind of going, what, where is this coming out of? But the reality is, from what we're hearing from millers, is that there is a significant cost saving coming in terms of feed from this May period onwards. Straights have reduced in price, therefore ultimately our compounds are going to come back in price. Fairly significant over that summer period, and the projections are that that's going to stay maybe fairly consistent into that back end. A lot of the feed is obviously fed in winter milk herds from that autumn period on, so we're projecting that there'll be something in the region of 60 to €65 a tonne of a saving there. Fertilizer, €20 a cow. Some people would think it'll be an awful lot more, but I said this recently at a walk actually in Donegal. First of all, we have to replenish silage stocks. So what I would say is we should be using our nitrogen allowances in the correct conditions to replenish silage stocks and make sure we grow enough feed. Secondly, there's been a move away from P&K and compounds because nitrogen was so expensive. We envisage where people are allowed, there will be a switch back, and there should be a switch back to more compounds usage. So maybe the saving on fertilizer isn't going to be as big as people think as a result. Contractor, we're saying, remains the same as 2023 for the simple reasons is the price of machinery is increased, energy and diesel is obviously remaining relatively high and doesn't seem to be changing. Labour is obviously a challenge in terms of our contractors, and then in terms of the actual running costs as well. So we don't see that changing on 2023 levels. All other variable costs increased by 5%. And that's what I'm saying in terms of there's this creep in costs that we've seen over the last maybe 12 or 18 months that seems to be continuing. When it comes to fixed costs, then we're saying that they're going to remain constant at just under €900 per cow, for the reasons being, right, yes, there will be a reduction in terms of the ESB charge, which increased significantly in 2023, but there is higher interest charges. there is there is more money spent on labour, and that's often not for any more labour. It's just an increase in the cost of labour, and land rental charges have increased across the board. So those three are going to outweigh the savings on the savings of energy. So the projection there you can see as a result of those assumptions is that although there is a saving projected to the tune of about €120 per cow, it's maybe not as big as people think, Declan, and we need to be aware of that. And like that really is catching farms in terms of from a cash flow perspective. Costs are going to remain high. We probably need to manage that at farm level in terms of from that cash flow perspective, in terms of the work we do at a cash flow, that it doesn't catch us out later in the year or early in the spring of 2025.
And James, does that capture, say, extra feed gone in this spring, or are you just talking from your autumn calver through? Is that costings are
no,
just
that ultimately we've kept the quantities the same there. So if there is additional feed gone in there in this system, if we don't save it in the remainder of the year, the reality is that €120 of a cost saving isn't actually going to come to fruition. What we would have seen is, and in Johnstown Castle, the feed rate hasn't actually changed that much in the spring. Aidan would keep the cows on that kind of 6-7 kilos until he gets them settled in onto grazing twice a day anyway. So he was saying to me that maybe the feeding rate, okay, it's probably 10 days wrong, but that there's not an awful lot of additional feed going in. So farms need to just, in terms of, I suppose, budget where that is for their own personal circumstances. But as I say, I've heard it throughout the spring, feed's reducing, fertilizers reducing. There's obviously going to be a massive cost saving. When we actually look at it, it's not going to be as big as people think. So just in terms of maybe a summary on that, there's a wide variation of costs at individual farm level. So know your own costs. High input doesn't significantly mean high output. Like if we look at these farms are achieving just shy of 550 kilos of milk solids for those costs we look at. If we look at some of the national stats for liquid milk farms, we're down at 460, 470, 480 kilos of milk solids, Declan. So if those costs are going in to produce 470, 480 kilos of milk solids, margins are going to be extremely tight and cash is going to be tight as a result. There's a significant increase in costs associated with keeping the cow from 2021 to 2023. As I said, €450. For 100 cows, that's 45,000 in cash that's gone ahead the system. Costs are projected to reduce in 2024, as I said, but maybe not to the level farmers think. It's important to know your own figures and complete an e-profit monitor. I can't stress that enough. We're seeing more farms come forward with cash flow issues. The farms that constantly manage and monitor cash usually don't get into the same difficulties maybe to the farms that don't. And manage the feed budget will really manage the overall cost structure. So correct calving pattern, make sure we're efficiently producing liquid milk. We don't want to be overproducing in that period because it's a higher cost period. The correct genetics, which is a longer term game and maybe something John will talk about later in the year. And also then in terms of forage quality and silage quality, but don't forget about grass when we do get to it, that we're getting the right grass into our cows. So that's where I'm at. And if there's any questions on any of that, folks, we'll take them. So yes, there's going to be a saving in costs. Hopefully it'll be bigger than I'm projecting, and I can come back next year and say, do you know what? I was wrong, thankfully.
Hopefully you're more than a fiver out next year, James. Thanks very much for that update, folks. We have a few questions, so we'll go through them.
Just stop sharing.
One, Daniel, I might come to you first. Milk protein levels have dropped. What can I do to improve it? Maybe Daniel's. Yeah. You're on mute there, Daniel.
Thank you, Declan. Unfortunately, that's a kind of something that we're seeing quite a bit at the minute. I suppose quick thing is it's an indication of deficiency in energy supplies. So I suppose do a quick few checks just to make sure that your energy in your total diet, a lot of cases, still a high percentage of silage in the diet. check what the meal feeding rate is with that, and look at the quickest fix solution to that is maybe more meal, but get grass in. So if you're only getting 3 hours in, you're going to see that reasonably quickly, and it's going to have more positive effects in terms of not only the protein, it'll help maintain that body condition score, because like our next objective on a spring system anyways is our breeding. So get the grass in there, but in the short term, if you can't get the grass for a few more days, just check that your meal feeding rate is matching that, but your grass should be your goal in the short term and the longer term.
Right. And hopefully, looking at the forecast, look, by the weekend, things should be definitely improving, and into next week looks dry. So hopefully the end is in sight for this extended long winter period. John, one for you. If you had silage ground grazed off tight, could you spread slurry if it's watery using the low emission system, or is it still too late? Would you recommend?
No, it's too late. There's a high risk of it coming back in, and if it went dry now after you put it out, and on even on a 1,000 of a cover, we're talking about feeding liquid milk cows here over the winter. We're talking about cutting early, and realistically that's in 3 to 4 weeks time. So no, too late.
Lovely. And on that one, so could you just go with straight nitrogen and then get your slurry out after the first cut? Is that going to be okay if your soil indexes are okay?
Yeah, look, ideally go with something like 29-0-14. It's a protected urea and it has sulfur in it and it has K. So if you're going with a bag and a half of that, you're getting a bit of K out anyway, 20 units. It's probably as much as you put out anyway over the space if you're going to be cutting in 3 to 4 weeks time. So yeah, it's I would probably include something like or a cut sward or an 18-6-12 if you have an allowance. But I suppose the point being, don't over fertilize it with nitrogen, because we do want to get it. I think we need to get it done, get the first cut done and out of the way, and get we have our slurry tanks full, and we need to get that back out in May and close up then for a second cut at the end of June, and then we can make a decision then on third cut. Some of it could be baled up early as really high quality stuff, and part of it could be left go on. So I think get it done. Too late for slurry. Get it done early, and go again.
Lovely. Another one then on P allowances. If you don't know your P allowance, how do you find out exactly what you can spread?
Talk to your advisor.
So is it going to vary from field to field, John, or is it just your farm overall allowance?
So yeah, it'll be an overall allowance based on your soil samples and your stocking rate, and the amount of meal you're feeding. And to be fair, the only way of finding out now in the scenario we're in now with a fertilizer register and is to check your allowance before you go spreading anything like an 18-6-12 or an 07-30. It's just too risky anymore. Yep.
Lovely stuff. That's all the questions I have, unless there's anything else coming in there, lads, that I can't see, but I don't think so. Just for a second, I just want to, while I'm speaking to people and just want to mention the Future Milk Programme. So you would have got a text earlier on today on the Future Milk Programme. So this is our sustainability programme. So there's been a good uptake so far, but just folks, if you those that haven't signed up, we're still saying to get signed up as quick as possible. So those information packs went out about 3 weeks ago at this stage. So all the information on the Future Milk Programme, the video or the text that went out this evening that you would have got has a link to a video with some more detail on it. Send your signed forms back to Farm Services. There's the address, or if you need a form, you can email farmservices@aurivo.ie or get on to any one of the Farm Services team, and there are all the contact details for them. While I have my number up there, look, we've also created a WhatsApp group for the Winter Milk Programme. So if you would like to be included on that, just give me a text and I will add you into that group. And further events for the Winter Milk Programme will be put in there. And as we said, ideally we would have been out on farm this spring, but given the conditions, we said we'd go a webinar for now, but we will be back out on farm later in the year, right region. So again, if you want to get involved with that, you can get in touch with me or John or anything there, and we'd be delighted to have you later on the year. So folks, thanks very much for tuning in tonight. Just like to thank the panel, James, Daniel and John. This has been recorded, so we will put it up and we'll text it out to all suppliers as well, just if there's anything you want to look back on. But apart from that, hopefully the weather's picking up and we'll speak to you all again soon.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.